evening, everybody. And I acknowledge as well the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, and I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And of course, this is always will be Aboriginal land forever. And I just want to make a little bit of amendment to what I did in Geneva. I did not work at the World Council of Churches. This gentleman sitting here operating the camera, my husband, Peter Brock, he was the one who worked there as director for youth, ecumenical youth program of the World Council of Churches. I studied there at the University of Geneva. I did my master's degree in development studies. So, and for most of the time, I've done a lot of volunteer work for human rights in the Philippines, using the United Nations human rights system. So, indeed, the Australian government has provided support to the murderous Duterte regime, which comes to the end on June 30, 2022. Duterte will be replaced by the son of the murderous dictator Ferdinand Marcos, who enjoyed the support of the government of the United States and Australia, despite massive corruption, human rights violations of all kinds, and wreaking havoc on the Filipino people. So, I will give you a bit of what the Philippine society is. So, the mode of production in the Philippines is semi-colonial and semi-feudal. So when the national democratic concerned forces or economies were asked, why is it that they haven't invested on the agricultural and rural areas in the Philippines? And of course, their answer was, there is more profit in keeping land holdings backward. So they don't want to develop the rural areas in the Philippines. They don't want to have the agricultural land to be developed in the Philippines. They just want it backward because they earn more. And apart from that, they have slaves, the slave workers, and the rest of their families who also work for the landlords. So, one thing more that you have to know, 70% of the whole population are landless. And these people live below poverty line. And we have 110.8 million Filipinos. And 2.1 of them are overseas working in a very, very appalling work condition. And one of them is, of course, in Australia. So there's no heavy industry, manufacturing. And what props up the economy of the Philippines? It's the remittances of the overseas Filipino workers. So that's what the Philippines is. So, of course, Duterte has to be a tyrant, and he knows that he can use tyranny, he can use fascism in everything that he can put his hands on. So, apart from the Marawi City tragedy, if we can call it as such, there is a continuing aerial bombing and mortar shelling by government forces in the areas where there is deposit of minerals. And mostly these areas are inhabited by poor peasants and also indigenous peoples. And that's continuing even before the election. And of course, in 2017, martial law was declared in that Muslim city, Marawi City in southern Philippines. And of course, what follows next is the displacement of communities during military actions. And this city is not the only city that has been declared informally with martial law. And of course, before that, And I'm sure you have heard of documentation in the media. We have the war on drugs that have several thousands of Filipinos, mostly poor, who have been killed. And they were called as drug addicts and drug peddlers. And most of these cases have been reported to the United Nations, and many are not true. So what is it? It was a cover-up for Duterte's own family members who are actually involved in drugs. And then what have been done by the human rights activists? Of course, the human rights activists in the Philippines have fought against all of this, have done a lot of campaigns, brought it up to the United Nations and to the European Council. What do we get after that? Activists are called terrorists. That's who we are. And even here in Australia, Migrante has been tagged by the government as terrorists, communist fronts, and all sorts of things that they can put us in trouble. So what we must acknowledge is that Australian governments have supported repressive, tyrannical, and corrupt regimes in the Philippines for over 50 years. Australia has acted as the junior partner of the U.S. in extending its support to successive regimes in the Philippines. In the years of the Cold War, anti-communism provided the rationale for this support. Now the war on terrorism. And this rationale on war on terrorism, that's actually what they're using now as a framework in their repression. So what are the things that are clear support of the Australian government to the tyrannical Duterte? So first of all, in the form of military aid and cooperation. And you can see that, in the news, I'm sure that some of you have heard of this. The Australian government has provided 2 aircraft, spy aircraft, as a surveillance to the so-called extremists in the Philippines. And in the case of the Marawi city, they have this Maote group, whom they term as the terrorists, and they have used this aircraft to survey them, so that I think this is similar to, it's a bigger, drone sort of, aircraft, and they can see where these people are. And indeed, they were able to trace them and kill them. And then also, we take note that under Duterte, 2 developments are important. In August 2017, a photo emerged of Nick Warner, the Director General of the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, the ASIS, joining President Duterte in a fist bump. And this is really the signature hand gesture of Duterte over the years, including in his 2016 campaign for the presidency. Warner's action was at best naive, at worst an endorsement of Duterte at the height of murderous war on the drugs, with thousands killed and executed, of course. Then the second thing is Australia provided direct and decisive assistance to the Duterte regime as it drafted the anti-terrorism law, which have been roundly condemned for a too broad and vague definition of terrorism, inadequate rights protection, and a broadening of powers for the military and executive arm of the government. And Jayson will talk more about this anti-terrorism law. So Australia, alongside with the United States and China, donated counter-terrorism weapons and equipment. And of course, they have donated 300 M4 carbines, 200 Glock 21 pistols, 4 M134D Gatling style machine guns, and 100 M203 grenade launchers. So this this is very clear that Australia has really given, these weapons. In effect, they're really for war. Australia is training the Philippines to have a war on its people. That's the first thing we have to say. So, I go back to that martial law in Marawi City, in Mindanao, southern Philippines, in 2017. The residents of Marawi were given only 6 hours to vacate their homes and businesses. Long lines of vehicles and residents on foot, including women and children, the sick and the elderly, descended from Marawi City, most with only the clothes on their backs. Testimonies from other witnesses have said that it is a harrowing experience, the hurried evacuation on that day. But after the siege began, when gunfire exchange and long walks to nearby municipalities with little food and water, characterized by that's how their escape was described by these people. So the aerial bombings and mortar shelling by government forces commenced, and it continued for the next 5 months. So the 250 hectares of what was once a vibrant commercial and residential part of the city was turned into rubble. And so what is it now? So after the people were flushed out of their houses, they were not allowed to go back until now. And they said that they will rebuild Marawi City. So who were on the queue to rebuild it? It's the multinational companies, which basically have also partnership with China and of course Japan to rebuild it. So now it turned to be a project of the imperialist neighbors of the Philippines. So what is the meaning for that today? Because the vice president who won is a Duterte. It continues on. And that's what we call on you to please, support us in our campaigns, and also that we will be able to expose this with the Filipino community, of course. That's what we will do. But most of all, with the rest of Australians. Because this is our taxpayers' money being used to wage a war against the Philippines. In a sense, the Australian government is complicit to having a war against the Filipino people in collaboration with the Philippine government. And we believe that this will continue. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. I know that you're here because you care for the Philippines. I assume that many of you are generally familiar about the human rights situation in the Philippines. At least that it has gotten worse since Duterte came to power. That the state of democracy is getting worse and worse, especially now that the next president apparently is the son of the former dictator Ferdinand Marcos. And judging from the title of this session of politics in the pub today, you're probably also concerned that Australia may have contributed to this democratic decline. Now, some of you might associate Duterte with China and probably even Russia rather than the West, right? And that would not be an incorrect view. But what I will argue today is that the West, including Australia, did contribute as well to Duterte's tyranny. There is a case to be made that these three wars, the war on terror, the war on drugs, and the war on facts, which catapulted Ferdinand Marcos Jr. to power, are connected. There's a thread connecting all of them. So what I want to say today really is that they all amount to an all-out war against dissent, right? and that Australia did contribute to this all-out war against dissent. There are many things to be said about that, but I will just make a specific argument that the West, including Australia, contributed to this democratic decline by mindlessly promoting counterterrorism in a country such as the Philippines, which is ditching even liberal democracy. Forget about social democracy, even liberal democracy and human rights. Okay, so that is the argument that I'm gonna be making. So first, I will sort of talk a little bit more about Duterte's tyranny. And Jane already very ably painted, a very comprehensive picture of what it is like in the Philippines under Duterte. But I just want to zero in some, very specific points to get a grip of what is this tyranny that we're talking about. So of course, if you talk about Duterte's tyranny, you cannot miss the war on drugs. All the world knows about the very aggressive anti-drug campaign that Duterte has launched in the Philippines. It has killed tens and thousands of people, mostly ordinary people, supposedly street-level peddlers and drug users. Okay. So, this war on drugs has killed tens of thousands of people. That in itself is very alarming, but that's not the most alarming element of this war on drugs. I would argue that what's even more alarming than that is that the society, apparently, if you believe in the surveys at least, supports this war on drugs. Alright? So, according to the surveys, Duterte has enjoyed popular support throughout his presidency. Even now, Duterte enjoys popular support. High popular support at that. So there is seeming public approval for the killings of drug addicts. The view is that drugs is the problem in the Philippines. It's not about the over-concentration of, land ownership in the hands of a few elite. It's not about the lack of development. It's just the drug problem. So you see already here that the war on drugs is essentially about dissent. It's about distracting people to think that the problem is just the drug problem. The second thing that I want to point out is that the war on drugs presupposes that there are some people who are not worthy of human rights. That to solve the problem, we just have to wipe out some people. Maybe a lot of people. No? But the point is, this war on drugs is against human rights. Right? Okay. Now, the last thing I want to point out about the war on drugs is that obviously there's impunity for all of these killings. There's hardly any serious investigation of the killings in the Philippines, and that's why a case has been started outside the Philippines, before the International Criminal Court to get the investigation going. Okay, but this means that Duterte enjoys impunity for all of these killings, and this results in fear of Duterte. Alright? Duterte says this fear is good because what we want to do is to instill fear in the hearts of the drug pushers and the drug syndicates so that the drug trade can be ended in the Philippines. In theory, that sounds good. But in reality, the fear is really installed in the hearts of those who oppose Duterte. So these include not only ordinary people who may be critical of Duterte, but politicians, judges, even local bosses who may be supporting a different drug syndicate that the Duterte government favors. Okay. Now, add to that a fourth element. Disinformation. Okay? Duterte essentially paved the way for the presidency of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. because he demolished journalism in the Philippines. The first thing Duterte attacked, besides the drug addicts, as I said, he was concerned about, this is all about silencing dissent. The first thing he made sure was that journalists, the traditional media, will be silenced. I admit the media in the Philippines, as in elsewhere, including Australia, is an imperfect tool, right? They're biased, they could be biased, they're owned by corporations, they're not entirely objective, but still, there are some norms by which to hold them to account. Norms such as objectivity, the journalist ethic, the law against slander and all that. In the Philippines, the main information system is no longer traditional media. Traditional media is now fringe. The main source of information in the Philippines are the disinformation machines. On the top of these are the PR firms, the public relations firms, the advertising firms, who promote misinformation, including manufacturing support for administration through what are called influencers. These are people who have lots of following in social media and who influence in turn micro-influencers, bloggers. In the Philippines, if you engage in, it's almost impossible to engage in decent political or social discourse. Because as soon as you point to evidence that this and that happened, because the traditional media says so, what they will tell you is, you're fringe, right? Because things such as Rappler, ABS-CBN, The Inquirer, they think these are fringe. The mainstream is what they get from, is what is provided now by the disinformation machines. And this is how Marcos Jr. was able to say martial law was the golden age in the Philippines. Okay, so this is the face of Duterte's tyranny, right? The misinformation machine reinforces the view among ordinary people within society that some people just don't deserve to exist, and that killing is an acceptable everyday solution to social problems. All right. The last thing I want to point out about the Duterte tyranny is that not only has Duterte targeted addicts, this is a war on drugs after all, right? But really, he has also targeted the yellows, meaning people who are associated with the former Aquino administration, and not only the Aquino administration, everyone associated with the so-called EDSA, people power hegemony. And anyone who has ever been associated with resistance, in effect, to the Marcos dictatorship, they're yellows. Okay? The Reds, the leftists, who are the traditional targets of extrajudicial killings, even before Duterte. The killings of the leftists did not really abate, and it became worse under Duterte. So the point now, the point now is, besides the addicts, whom did Duterte target? So I said the yellows, the reds, and then actually during the COVID pandemic, even quarantine violators were subject to attacks by Duterte. He said, I'm gonna kill you. I'm gonna kill you to make you comply, right? Okay. And now, okay, so this is the face of Duterte's tyranny. So the question now before us is it really the case that Australia contributed to such a situation? And the point that I'm going to make today is that actually there is a case to be made. That unfortunately, Australia has not ensured the best, outcome, for democracy in the Philippines. Why do I say that? Well, didn't Australia support the war on terror, right?
Yeah.
So before Duterte, Filipinos were already used to extrajudicial killings in the name of the war on terror. The chief targets of the war on terror in the Philippines, were not really the Islamists. The West may have been more concerned with the Islamic threat, but in the Philippines, the terrorists are not the Islamists. The terrorists were the communists. The terrorists were the leftists, the union leaders, the peasant organizers, right? Okay. At least they were considered terrorists by GMA, and this by Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo. And despite this, the West did support Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo. Even now, actually, in Australia, not only the Abu Sayyaf group, which is an Islamist group, is listed as a terrorist group in Australia. The DFAT has also listed Jose Maria Sison as a terrorist. Jose Maria Sison being very associated with the communists. Right? Okay, so even before Duterte, Filipinos were already used to extrajudicial killings and were already used to thinking that it was all right to just get rid of people we don't like. And these were the leftists at that point. Now, what did Australia do when Duterte became president? Did it stop supporting the promotion of counterterrorism in the Philippines? No. In fact, Duterte created a new anti-terrorism law to expand the powers of the state, to expand the powers of the police, so it can run after more people. And do you know, supposedly, in the international community, who led in giving legal and technical assistance to this effort? According to the Sydney Morning Herald, it was Australia. So I would say the promotion of counterterrorism in places like the Philippines is best described as ritualistic. It has no regard for what is the situation in the country. What is the likely impact of such a support? So if not ritualistic, probably mindless or even reckless and irresponsible. As I said, a case can probably be made for Australia and other Western countries supporting the war on terror in the Philippines because of the Islamist threat, But you can also see that the Philippine government also enrolled the West into an all-out war against leftists, right? And Western governments did not ensure that support for the war on terror would be translated into killings against these leftists. So I said Filipinos already used to the acceptability of extrajudicial killings. Even before Duterte, this was already clear within the armed forces of the Philippines. Within the armed forces of the Philippines, it's clear that they wanted an aggressive campaign of killings, even against above ground leftist activists. So the question can be asked, what has Australia done to ensure that its support for the fight against the Islamic terrorists did not translate to killings against the leftists, right? So, so I end here. Now, I have just focused on the role of Western governments in mindlessly pursuing a counterterrorism agenda in a place like the Philippines. There are other things that we can talk about, like misinformation, etc. But I want you to carry on the conversation, right? I've just started it. I want you to carry it on. Now, what else can we think of? What can we do better to ensure that Australia supported the best outcome for democracy and human rights in the Philippines? Thank you. Yeah, so I'll just emphasize that the big role that misinformation played in this repeat of history. How could it be that after only 36 years, the Filipinos sort of said EDSA was a myth. The EDSA.
Just to mention that I am against Duterte husband.
Yes. How could it be that after just 36 years, they come back to the polls and say, actually, we like martial law. Actually, we do like First Ferdinand Marcos. He was the best president ever. And so it's not only me, but most people are saying, there are a lot of factors, right? But one of the biggest factor is misinformation. So what I mean by this is that the misinformation machines have done a terrific job. As I said, through Duterte's attack on the media, and through this, because even how Duterte won his campaign, it was through social media, it was through technology. So what the victory of Bongbong Marcos Jr. shows is that apparently through tech, through social media, through this algorithmic, algorithm-driven manipulation of people, you can actually erase and rewrite history in people's minds. Now, after this feat, what they will now try to do is to make the erasure and rewriting of history more permanent by actually disappearing the official archives and records. Even now, for example, in the University of the Philippines, my former colleagues tell me that certain books about the Marcos years have been red tagged. It used to be that you just red tag people. But now, they actually specify which books should not be accessible in the library. Imagine that. Now, you may have known that the victims of the Marcos Marcos martial law, victims of human rights violations during the Marcos martial law, filed a class suit in the United States and won it, actually, right? And in the process of doing that, they documented exactly who are these people who got tortured, who are these people who were killed. The records of that are kept in the University of the Philippines main library. Right? Now that they hold power, they can make these records disappear. We know that they have made records disappear before. The Integrated Bar of the Philippines once made an audit of the graft cases against Imelda Marcos under Ramos regime. And what did they find out? The ombudsman supposedly lost the documents, the evidence, case files were missing, right? And this contributed to Imelda Marcos' success in some of her cases. So they will certainly try to make the erasure of history more permanent. So the challenge now is for Filipinos, with the help, hopefully, of people outside the Philippines, to preserve the archives, right? And also, not only that, beyond preserving history in the archives, to use what we know, no? To counter misinformation. It's harder said than done, no? Because we don't have as much money, no? To run a well-oiled, misinformation campaign, no? To rebrand, no? Kleptocrats, no? But we do have, no, in the Philippines, something else, no? I didn't mention this in my talk, no, but Leni Robredo, okay, the lady who so, courageously fought Ferdinand Marcos, no, in the recent presidential elections, no, she was able to mobilize a lot of people, no? I hope you get a chance, no, to read about her and to watch some of the rallies, no, that she has held. No? We've not seen mammoth rallies in the Philippines, no, during the Duterte administration, no, protesting Duterte's war on drugs, but we saw such rallies in the Leni campaign. It's amazing. No? Watching her rallies, you would think the EDSA spirit is back. No? You would think, no? Wow, how did this lady pull that off? No? She was able to mobilize a lot of people to actually denounce, no, the impending revival of Marcos kleptocracy. No? So I would say all is not lost, no, in the Philippines. No? So both Jen and I have made it sound like, no, the Filipino society is a lost cause. They've all been duped by the disinformation machines. No? But a lot of people are still fighting. No? Let's just bracket for a moment that the results of the election can be trusted, because many people do question, no, that can be trusted. But just let's bracket that for a moment. Let's just assume that those who fought the Marcos revival number only in the 18 million people. The 18 million people who voted for Leni. That's not insignificant. No? That's not an insignificant number. And I think there's hope in there. Even if we're just 18 million, that's a lot. No? We can, if we can continue energizing resistance to the Marcos revival, then there's hope for the Philippines.
The answer to that, of course, is yes, and I will read this Operation Augury. This is the Australian Defence Force tactics. Basically it's a framework that they use, to assist those who are fighting Islamic extremism. And so, they have deployed, of course, I said already, spy planes, the Orion spy planes, 2 Navy patrol boats, a team of special forces, and there were 100 Australian Defence Force personnel who are specialists on counter-terrorism that actually trained the Filipino military. So, Marie Spain actually publicly declared the rapid deployment of about 80 military trainers from Australia who are skilled at urban warfare in the Middle East to drill Filipino soldiers in their finer points of close-range combat against the heavily armed militia known as Maute. That's the so-called Islamic group extremists in Mindanao.
But the same tactics were used against
You want to?
the same tactics were used against human rights defenders and
Yes.
trade unionists and indigenous peoples. They're used in Mindanao. They're used in Negros.
Yeah, so it's not only in Mindanao. This is what we know that the media has exposed, and of course, Marie Spain has been quoted, when she publicly declared that. But we know that if there were like how many did they say 10,000 members of the armed forces of the Philippines who were trained between 2017 and 2019, and they were the 10,000 soldiers, definitely would have been deployed all over the Philippines. And you know, most of these provinces that they have been deployed into are actually places that the National Democratic Front of the Philippines have organized and where the New People's Army operates. So you will see that the target is not only Islamic extremism, but also the National Revolutionary Democratic Forces, as well as those human rights activists who, who hold on to real democracy and also promote peace talks. So that's also one area that we have been driving to the Australian government to support the peace talks between the National Democratic Front of the Philippines and the Philippine government. But they're not interested in that. They're more interested in giving the arms and really, fight it out in a war.
I'm really just a lawyer, right? Okay. I have some thoughts about the future of the opposition. Yeah. Because going into the election, the leftists were kind of divided about how to approach Leni Robredo. So on the one hand, there were people like Walden Bello and Calyodi who thought, well, Leni doesn't really represent a very radical enough alternative to the neoliberal system, and therefore they decided to run their own campaign, right? So as you know, some of you might know, Calyodi de Guzman, who is a labor leader, he ran for president. Very historic, the first labor leader to run for president in the Philippines. Okay? And then there were other leftists, namely the National Democrats. They thought that it's true, Leni Robredo is not a radical enough alternative to the neoliberal system, but they thought the left is not strong enough to run its own campaign, and the best chance to defeat a Marcos restoration was to support Leni Robredo. Okay. My own personal opinion is that the latter leftists were correct, right? It is fortunate that the leftists are not all shut out of the the Leni campaign. I think that's a good thing, no? We actually did contribute significantly, no? To the resistance to the Marcos restoration, which is now, the face of which is now the Leni campaign. And now Leni is saying, without conceding the election to Marcos Jr., she's saying the resistance to disinformation, the resistance to Marcos will not stop. Good thing, right? Something which is different from, what the Americans did. As you may have heard, President Biden has already called to congratulate Marcos Jr. No? The Australian government did the same, right? Following on cue. No? We're not very surprised about that. But Leni, she hasn't conceded the election yet, and she said the fight will go on. No? So she said, I may not be proclaimed president, but I will convert the movement, and it's not no exaggeration. No? It really does feel like a movement. This election campaign for Leni will be converted into the largest, she calls it, volunteer network. Okay, and leftists, at least the National Democrats, are part of that network. I think that's a good thing, no? And I'm betting, but I'm just a lawyer, I'm not a political analyst, that Walden's group will soon join forces too. Yeah? Because we do need everyone reuniting against Marcos. Thank you.